Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're jumping straight in to talk about the top 3 reasons why you are losing money when doing DeFi liquidity provision. I'm not going to beat around the bush. Let's get straight into it. We work with hundreds of fast track clients in our community, and these are the top 3 mistakes we see when people end up losing money and how you can avoid doing so. So, mistake number 1, what we see with clients who end up losing large amounts of capital, and it's not very frequent, but sometimes people get carried away when they're doing DeFi liquidity provision. Mistake number 1 is taking too much risk by chasing APYs. Okay. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to jump over the crystal here very, very quickly. What I've done is I've come into the hot pools area, I've sorted by 24-hour APR. And the problem that we see is when people get too greedy. Ultimately, if you end up chasing yield like 19,000% APR, yes, it's possible to make good fees. Absolutely. But what you're doing when you're looking at opportunities strictly based on 24-hour APR is you're catching a very quick trend. You're catching possibly even a pump and dump. You're catching a meme coin that's making an accelerated move. And what typically happens with those opportunities is, yes, they'll make a very quick move over a 24, 48-hour period. But then once there's a sell off, once there's a cool off, you end up holding the bag, having exposure to that meme coin. It pulls back 30, 40, 50%, and you lose a substantial amount of your initial deposit capital. So much so that the fees you've just earned from providing liquidity are not enough or sufficient to offset the yield that you've earned from providing liquidity in that pool opportunity. Okay. Now, look, we've all got a bit of degen in us. We do always like to take a little bit of risk sometimes, and that's okay. We're okay with you putting, 3, 4, 5% of your portfolio into a higher yielding, higher risk, higher volatility pool opportunity. But the problem arises when you get a little bit carried away. You start to think you can outsmart the market and outsmart the moves being made by some of these highly volatility meme coins, and you start putting 40, 50, 60% of your portfolio into these types of meme opportunities. Okay. You can't get carried away with those high APRs. These are just a very quick snapshot in time. These are not going to be sustained over long periods. And that's why you want to be providing liquidity to the blue chip assets like Ethereum, like Bitcoin, like Solana, where we know there's very, very consistent volume over time, and consistent volume over time equals consistent fees for you as a liquidity provider. So avoid chasing yield that is very, very high. You're going to get burned if this pulls back sharply, and you don't want to be left holding the bag. Mistake number 2 that we see when people end up losing money in DeFi liquidity provision is when you end up setting your ranges too narrow. Again, what happens here with concentrated liquidity pools is you have the ability to provide liquidity at concentrated levels. And typically, when we're doing exposure to an asset like Ethereum, a range something like this, that's roughly speaking, if we measure this, this is about 25 to 26% wide. That is a nice range for an Ethereum pool. The problem arises when you start providing liquidity that is way too narrow at a concentrated level that's maybe only, something like 4 to 8% wide for Ethereum. This range here, let's say from 4273 up to 4,500, that's only a 5% range for Ethereum. Now, you're going to get away with this very briefly as a range, but what happens when you end up going out of range, either to the top side or to the downside? Because this particular range is likely to only keep you in range maybe for a day or two before it goes out. What happens is you end up having to buy back Ethereum at a higher price up here, and you end up having to sell your Ethereum at a loss if you go out of range on the downside. Now, that's okay if you're only having to do that maybe once a month and do different types of execution of rebalancing strategies. But if you end up having to do multiple rebalances per day, or even 3 to 4 rebalances per week, what happens is you're buying back ETH at a higher price, you're selling ETH at a loss too frequently. What you're doing here is you're locking in the divergence loss that's happening from the price action deviating from your entry point. And ultimately, that's going to continue to eat into your deposit capital. We've seen this before. We've executed tests. We've been doing this for multiple years. And I can tell you from experience, setting your range too narrow is going to lead to your deposit capital diminishing over time, so much so that it eats considerably into your profits and fees that you're generating from providing liquidity in the first place. And so it's just not worth it to be squeezing your range super, super tight and having to rebalance multiple times per week or even multiple times per day. So that is the second mistake that we see and could be a very legitimate reason as to why you're losing money in liquidity pools. You need to be a little bit more conservative with those ranges, still getting phenomenal fees in the region of 5, 6, 7, 8% per month, but obviously tolerating a little bit more volatility by going wider with your range and making sure that you're not having to excessively rebalance your capital. Okay. Mistake number 3 that we see when people end up losing money is essentially not creating exit criteria when you're getting into a new pool opportunity. Okay. The exit criteria that you want to be thinking about should be invalidation levels, price action, trends breaking, and you should be thinking about those before entering a new pool opportunity. Again, let's think about Ethereum here as this particular opportunity. If we're looking at the trend for Ethereum and we can zoom out on the daily chart just a little bit here, we're in a pretty solid uptrend for the price action of Ethereum here that hasn't really broken since these lows back at the beginning of April. Now, we're testing this trend line. We broke above the 200-day. We're also breaking out of a longer-term weekly downtrend that goes all the way back to the highs of the previous cycle here. So the trend is looking pretty nice. But when you're entering a new pool opportunity, even if you're going with a nice range that we were talking about here, something in the region of 20 to 25% wide, you want to be thinking about the exit criteria or what is necessary to happen in order for you to consider exiting this particular pool. Now, in some cases, that might be simply, a 40% drawdown in the price of the asset might be sufficient for you to say, hey, look, that is enough of a drawdown. I don't want to be providing liquidity here any longer. That is my trigger for exiting this pool. Maybe it is the fact that it's going towards a long-term trend. And if it breaks below this long-term trend line going back to April of this year, then this point here around $3,600, $3,700 would be your point to close out the pool, convert it into stable coins, and possibly wait for an entry point lower. Again, I'm not advocating any of these are right or wrong necessarily, but you want to be thinking about what is the criteria that needs to happen in order for me to seriously consider closing my pool and then looking for a better entry point. Again, maybe that closure of the pool is actually a take profit model. You think, or maybe you have an assumption or a theory that Ethereum can get up to somewhere around, $6,000 by the peak of the cycle. As the price continues to move up in this direction, you can obviously continue to rebalance your range to the upside. As we move price up, you keep stair stepping your way up. And then maybe by the time we get up close to this $6,000 region, that is the point at which you say, okay, by the time price actually moves all the way through this range, I'm going to be converted 100% into USDC. And therefore, I don't actually want to re-enter this opportunity because I think this is a great profit-taking level. By the time Ethereum gets up to $6,100, $6,200, I actually want to be fully converted into USDC. I no longer want to provide liquidity. And so at this point, by the time I exit the top of my range, I'm going to be converted into USDC. I'm going to keep that USDC as a profit. I'll have made some amazing fees all the way from $4,000 up to $6,200. And that is my take profit area. I take my stable coins and I begin to pivot towards a new opportunity. Maybe that is a stablecoin to stablecoin pool. Maybe it's a Pendle PT token with good rewards. Maybe it is some interest rate arbitrage with those stablecoin profits. So think about the exit criteria before you even open a new position. That is what I'm urging you to do. And that's going to help you ultimately be more profitable and avoid losses in the medium to long term. That is it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Those are the top 3 ways that we often see new members and clients in the UIG and in Fast Track losing money. Of course, when you get into the Fast Track program, you're going to get much more support. We do 10 live calls every single week. You're going to get handholding. You're going to get strategic guidance. You have access to multiple coaches with live calls, open office hour sessions where you can ask questions. So you're going to avoid making the mistakes we talked about in this video. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of a primer. Hopefully you've got a takeaway from those top 3 mistakes, and hopefully you're not making any of them yourself. If you are, hopefully this is food for thought. It gives you something to think about and thinking about strategizing and changing your strategy as you move forward. As always, please make sure to smash that thumbs up button right below my finger on the video. It helps to spread the good word. Make sure to comment if you enjoyed this. What types of other mistakes have you made in the past? Let us know in the comments below. Check out the link for the Fast Track program in the description also, and we'll catch you in the next one.